Hey everyone, welcome back. So we had just gone over the conceptual planning for our enemy factions, and now we're going to jump into the coding. So first of all, I'm just going to drag in the sprites that we'll be using for this section of the enemy ships. So I'm going to drag these three in here. And let's just go ahead and fix up their origins and collisions. So let's set their origin to the middle center and a collision mask. For these, I think I'm going to make them diamonds because they're a diamond shape. And you might be wondering why I have multiple frames for this one. It's actually not to animate it, it's to represent kind of its different stages of health. So this one is when it has like full shields and losing health down to none. And you'll also notice that when you import it, it automatically kind of chopped up the images into 5, and that's because I named it with an underscore strip 5, and GameMaker is set up so that if you do that, it will chop up the image automatically for you into whatever number of frames you put here. It'll just do it evenly. So that can be really handy if you're importing a lot of sprites at once. And let's move on to the other ones. So for the hunter, middle center, I might actually make this one an ellipse just so it kind of covers more ground. And for the raider, we'll make it middle center. Let's keep that one as a rectangle and we'll just make it a little bit smaller. Cool, so something like that. All right, so we're done with the sprites. Now let's go and set up our object hierarchies. So first of all, I'm actually going to make an object called obj faction. And this one is kind of like the big grandparent at the top of the hierarchy. So for example, if we wanted to refer to 3 different kinds of animals, so say a monkey, a dog, and a snake, we can separate those into mammals and reptiles, for example, kind of like enemies and allies. And then to refer to all of them, we would call them animals. They're all in the animal kingdom. So for us, that's kind of like what our faction object is doing. This is how we can refer to all of the ships, anything taking part in the faction system, which is going to be really useful for when we set up collisions with faction objects. And also for setting up shared kind of general variables. So for example, we know that all of the faction objects will have event like we've been doing for all of our variables so far. We're actually going to use this one, variable definitions. So this is pretty cool. It gives you a kind of separate space to set up variables and also a way of typifying them. So you can see over here, you can set a type. So a real number, an integer, a string, true, false, a resource even. So you can set a sprite or an object or something like that, an array or a list, and you can come into here and add different items. And you can even add a color, which is pretty cool. It has its own kind of built-in color picker. And actually, we might use this one to control the enemies and allies' colors, because at the moment, all of our sprites are white. And if we have just a bunch of white stuff on the screen, it's not going to be very clear who's part of which faction. So we might set up faction colors. And there is already a variable that does this called image blend. By default, everything is just tinted white, so we can set that as the default. This will kind of mean there's no blending. This won't have any effect on the object. And then in the factions, we'll make them red and blue, for example. And we'll do the same for a variable called faction. And we'll set this one to a string this time. So remember to put 2 quotation marks, and we will set this to neutral. All right, good. Now, I'm going to preemptively set up some groups because our object resources are about to get a little bit messy if we just leave everything here. So I'm going to call the first one ally, and we can drag the ship in here, enemy, and neutral. And let's drag the asteroid in here. We're actually going to leave the bullets unaligned. They're not going to be part of the faction system. They'll be kind of operating on their own terms. All right, and now let's set up the obj faction ally, and I'm going to make its parent the obj faction and its child the ship. And we'll do obj faction enemy, and again we'll make its parent obj faction. I'm also going to make the parent enemy, because I wanted a way of kind of referring to the enemy ships specifically. We might end up having different types of enemy objects, say like floating debris or basically just anything that doesn't behave like a ship, and we wouldn't include it here. But this way we also get to set up some variable definitions that are specific to enemy ships, so like speeds and directions and things like that. So we want its parent to be not the faction object, but the enemy faction object. So that way we're getting a hierarchy. And now let's go ahead and create the enemy objects themselves. So obj raider, and we can set the sprite. Obj hunter, and we'll set the sprite to hunter. And the brute. Alright, and let's come back to the enemy and add all of its children. So the raider, hunter, and brute. And if we just scroll up to the faction enemy, you can now see the kind of hierarchy working. So we have obj faction enemy, and then all of its children in here. So these objects, by the way, the faction objects, they won't ever appear in the game. They're just there for organization. And finally, our last one is going to be obj faction neutral. Its parent will be the faction, and its child will be the asteroid. Alright, so now we just need to overwrite these variables in the children objects, so in these three. So let's do the ally, and we'll click on variable definitions, and you can see those two have popped up here. And if we click on these, we can overwrite the default. So let's overwrite this one and make it maybe aqua. And this one we can change to ally. Cool. And now we'll go to the enemy. Variable definitions. Overwrite this and make it red. And we'll change this one to enemy. And we can actually just leave the neutral one because it's already inheriting the default neutral values. So that is all of the object setup. Now I want to change the way some of our objects are interacting with each other. So for example, if we come to the bullet, right now it has a collision with the asteroid, but I want it to collide with all of the faction objects. So we're going to change this to be a collision with obj faction. Now the only problem is that all of this code is specific to the asteroid object. So we could wrap this in an if check. We could check if the other object in the collision is equal to the asteroid, and then we could do the same for our enemy and ally objects, but that's just going to get messy very quickly. So instead of that, I'm going to actually cut all of this out and let the objects handle their own damage events. So they're all going to have an abstracted event where they can control how they take damage. So let's cut all of the code that was to do with taking damage for the asteroid. So we can see right here, the only kind of two things that we want to keep, I think, is just the destroy event for the bullet. And then everything else, we're going to hold shift and then click on the bottom one. We're going to cut all of this out. So we're leaving only this, and we're going to come along to the asteroid objects. Whoops. Here, and I'm going to add a user event, and it can be any of these. Let's just use one. And all of our faction objects are going to have an event like this. So this is the take damage event. So let's paste in all of this stuff. So we still want to set the score inside here. We want to play the audio. That's all fine. This was all specific to the asteroid, and now it has its own event that we can point to. Alright, so now if we head back to the bullet, we just need to tell the asteroid to run that event. So we need to drag in the user event block. So we can do that here. We want to make it call event 1. Remember, we were using event 1. And we want to apply this to the other object. So the other object in this collision. And it doesn't matter what object we're colliding with. Like I said, all of our faction objects, we're going to set up an event 1. The only thing is that we don't want necessarily the bullet to be damaging objects that are part of its own faction. So at the moment, I did say that it was unaligned, and that's true. But I actually do want it to have a faction variable and actually also a creator variable. And I want it to be checking. If it's colliding with something that is its own faction, I don't want it to damage it. So we'll set that to undefined. But when we actually make the bullet, when anything makes a bullet, it's going to overwrite this. So we haven't set that up yet, but we're going to make a script for that. So in here, we can check only if the other object's faction is not equal to our faction, only then do I want to do this. And not only that, but I do want it to destroy itself regardless. So if an enemy fires off a bullet and it hits another enemy ship, I still want that bullet to be destroyed. The only exception to that is its creator. I don't want it to interact with its creator at all, because remember, we're kind of creating the bullets on top of objects. And in that case, it would kind of immediately interact with its creator, destroy itself, and it would look like the bullet's not even firing. So we do need to be careful. We need to only be doing all of this if the OBJ faction is not the creator. So we're going to add to this, we're going to have creator, undefined, and this will also be overwritten later. So if the other object is not equal to its creator, then we can go ahead and do this. Now, the last thing I'm going to change about the bullet is its outside room event. So at the moment, we put this in here so that if the bullet went outside the room, it would destroy itself. I actually want to change this to be outside the camera, because at the moment, if we keep it as outside room, the bullets are going to persist off the screen, and it might hit a bullet off screen and then add to our score. It doesn't really make sense to me. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to delete this event. And in its step event, we're going to check if it goes outside the rectangle that is the camera. And actually, we can reuse the code that we set up here, the point in rectangle code. So I might actually just copy this and head back to the bullet and paste that in here. We want to just be applying this to ourselves though, so we'll get rid of that little pink outline. So point in rectangle, our position is what we're going to be checking, so not XXYY, that was for the script. Let's remove this padding. Yep, now the only problem is that we don't have access to the camera X and camera Y. Now remember, this function call was applying this code to the camera, and that was because we wanted to get access to the camera variables, which does still apply to us. We want to be checking. I might remove the padding, but I will need to pass over the bullets X and Y, so I'm going to just declare a temporary variable so that the object scope gets across. So we'll change this to XXYY and we'll put in our X and YY. So now the camera can actually get access to the bullets X position and Y position. And it will be checking this. And let's call this something different. Let's say bullet within camera. So now we can check if bullet within camera is not true. Then we will destroy ourselves. All right, good. So now I think we're done with the bullet. Now we just need to go and set up the user event ones of the other objects. So let's start with the player ship. Let's go over to OBJ ship. And so let's set up user event 1. And right now, I think when we were causing this ship to take damage, we were just destroying it. Eventually we might set up some HP, or we might check if we're invincible when we get to the power-ups or something like that. But for now, I'm actually just going to put destroy the instance. So that's what it will be doing when it takes health. It'll just be destroying itself. All right, now I also want to look at this event because this was a specific collision with the asteroid, but I also want it to be performing a lot of this code when it interacts with the enemy ships as well. So again, I'm going to change this event to the faction object. And I think actually a lot of this was also specifically destroying code. So I might grab the destroy code, so all of this, and put it in the destroy event. I think that makes more sense. So it does all of this stuff when it dies. But in the collision event itself, I'm actually going to tell it to run its user event 1. So let's put user event 1. Perfect. But just like the bullet, I want to be checking that it's not colliding with its own faction. So eventually we might have allied ships that we don't want it to collide with. So let's check if variable other.faction is not equal to our faction, then we want to do this. All right, so we're slowly kind of decoupling the places where we were referring to damage. Now we're not handling collisions differently. They all point to one place. And that will make things a lot easier later on when we want to kind of change how something reacts when it gets damaged. All right, great. So now that's the player set up as well. And actually, if we just test everything now, so we can see that the player's color is correct. So it's got the ally color. But if we go ahead and shoot, we actually just destroy ourselves. And remember, of course, that's because we haven't set the bullets faction variable up to the player. We didn't actually change that. It's still undefined. So that's the next thing that we have to set up. So we were creating the bullet here in the space event. And like I said, I'm going to want the enemy ships to also be able to create bullets. So we're going to cut all of this out and we're going to put it in a script. And actually, that will be really cool because when we have it in a script, we also have a place where we might want to make modifications to the bullet. So we might want to change its speed or something like that because I wanted some of the enemies to have faster or slower bullets. So let's do that. We're going to cut all of this. And we're going to make a script. And this one is going to be called create bullet. All right, and let's paste that in here. So now, before we even get started on that, let me just scroll back up to the ship. The way that we want this to work, so we'll be calling a script again, so we can drag in the execute script. We can select in our create bullet, and I want to be able to set a few things about it. So I want to set its direction. And remember, for the player, that was going to be its image angle, so wherever it's rotated to. And this one, I wanted to also set the speed. So let's put in, for example, 6. That's what we had it set to. All right, so now if we come back to the script, we can start setting this up in a kind of general way. All right, so we do want it to play this sound effect when we shoot. We do want it to create a bullet like this, and then we do want to go ahead and then change some things about the bullet. Because it's going to be a few, I might actually change this to instead be an apply to. And we're applying this to a new bullet. That one right there. So we're setting its direction, although we're not setting it to this. That was specific to the player. We want to set it to the argument 0. So we can do that. We can set it to... Actually, maybe we'll declare these first in temporary variables, just so we get the names of them. So the first argument was the direction. And the second one was the speed. All right, so I'll set that to dir, and I will set this one, so speed will be SPD. Now, I didn't have an argument for faction because at the moment, whoever runs this, we have access to its variables. This is kind of being run within the scope of the ship at the moment. So we can already just refer to its faction. So to pass this over correctly, I do need it to be a temporary variable because if I wrote, for example, faction inside here, it would be referring to its own faction. We want to refer to the player. So instead, I'm going to make fac for faction. And I will also do color, image blend. And actually, finally, there was one more thing the bullet needed. It needed to know what its creator was. So I will also do creator ID, and that is the ID of the object. All right, there we go. So we have our bullets set up. So let's test it and see if the player is now able to shoot a bullet and have that bullet interact with the asteroids. So let's try and shoot something good. So they're coming out blue, their color is being set, and they're shooting in the correct direction. But when we attack an asteroid, it's not being blown up. So why did that happen? Well, you might have caught this, but the problem is actually all the way back in OBJ asteroid. Now, I want this to serve as a reminder just to be really careful about the scope of everything and when you're copy and pasting code. So before, when we had this in the bullet, we had an apply to other because we were not referring to the bullet, we were referring to the OBJ asteroid to do all of this stuff. And at the moment, that is inappropriate. We don't need this here. So we want to move all of this outside the apply to, and we can delete that one. So if you have any bugs as you're going through this, that might be kind of one of the first things to check. Like I said, be really careful about these statements. So let's save and run that again. And let's try and shoot something now. There we go. So the asteroids are destroying themselves. Alright, so I think we're done for this tutorial. We've set up the ships and the asteroids, and in the next one we'll be setting up the enemy ships. So I will see you in that next one.